The 1980s danced beneath Hollywood's neon lights like an era intoxicated by its own brilliance, a time when youth crowned itself without asking permission from the passage of time. On the 29th of November, 1962, a boy named Andrew Thomas McCarthy was born into this world, destined to become a living symbol of that feverish decade, beautiful, talented, and doomed. But behind the glittering facade of fame lurked a story no one expected to see, a tale of how one man could soar to the heights of success and plummet into the abyss of despair before finding his path to redemption. At 19 years old, when most of his peers were just trying on their college caps and gowns, McCarthy had already made his major film debut. The 1983 movie Class placed him opposite the legendary Jacqueline Bisset, and this was merely the first note in a symphony of coming glory. Then followed the roles that became iconic: Saint, Elmo's Fire, Pretty in Pink, Mannequin, Weekend at Bernie's, film titles that now sound like incantations for an entire generation raised in front of television screens. He wasn't just an actor, he was part of the legendary Brat Pack, that very group of young stars whose faces graced magazine covers and whose lives seemed like an endless celebration. But on June 10th, 1985, an article appeared in New York Magazine that changed everything. A journalist coined a term, the Brat Pack, and this label stuck to the group of young actors like a curse. What seemed like a light-hearted joke transformed into a brand. Wealthy, spoiled, hedonistic teenagers more interested in nightlife than their craft. McCarthy received only a brief mention in that article, but the bite was deep. We were categorized in a way we didn't want to be, he recalls years later, and in his voice, the echo of that pain still resonates. However, the real drama was unfolding not on screen, but behind the scenes, in the shadow of spotlights, where a 12-year-old boy first raised a glass of alcohol, not understanding that this would mark the beginning of a 25-year war with himself. Nobody knew, not his colleagues, not the tabloids, not even McCarthy himself at first, that behind the image of a Hollywood heartthrob hid a young man quietly and methodically destroying himself from within. Alcohol gave him Dutch courage, confidence, sexiness, control, everything he never felt in real life. And then came cocaine. By 1987, during the filming of Mannequin, McCarthy was already drinking excessively and had developed a cocaine addiction. On the set of Less Than Zero, an ironically titled film, his cocaine use nearly led to a heart attack. Before a scene where he was supposed to jump into a pool, the actor took a hit. When his body plunged into the cold water, his chest seized with a painful spasm, and his heart felt ready to burst out. This was a moment when death looked him in the eyes, but the lesson had not yet been learned. The path to rock bottom was long and agonizing, a drug-fueled road trip across the country with friends, excessive drinking in dismal hotel bars, a near-bar fight in Colorado, police in Missouri, and cocaine scattered across the back seat of his car. When the officer approached the vehicle, McCarthy tried to look as if he had just woken up while his heart was about to explode from his chest. 3 years in the 90s were lost and painful. One morning, he woke up in his apartment violently sick, his body racked by convulsions, and he fell to his knees in despair over the abyss into which his life had descended. In 1992, at the age of 29, Andrew McCarthy finally asked for help. He entered a rehabilitation center and began a life without alcohol and drugs, a life he has maintained day in and day out for more than 30 years now. "There has to be somewhere to catch us, otherwise we fall," he would later say, speaking before hundreds of people, sharing his story of recovery. But McCarthy's story doesn't end with recovery. It continues with metamorphosis. From actor, he transformed into a director, helming episodes of cult series like Orange is the New Black and The Blacklist. He became a travel writer, an editor at National Geographic Traveler, winner of the Travel Journalist of the Year Award in 2010. His memoir, Brat, an 80s Story, published in 2021, became a New York Times bestseller, and in 2024, he directed the documentary Brats, attempting to reconcile with the ghosts of his past and that very article that changed everything 40 years ago. What really happened to Andrew McCarthy? This is the question asked by those who remember his young face on screens in the 80s. This is a story about fame and fall, about addiction and liberation, about how one label can haunt a person for decades, and about how to find peace with oneself when the whole world has already decided who you should be. The ghost of the Gilded Dreamers era still wanders the corridors of memory, but now it has a voice to tell the truth. 1983 became a portal to another world for a young man who had barely crossed the threshold of his 20s. Andrew McCarthy didn't just debut in cinema. He burst into it with that self-assured audacity that only youth grants, unaware of fame's price. The film was called Class, and in it, a 20-year-old boy from New Jersey shared the screen with Jacqueline Bisset herself, a woman whose name was already inscribed in gold in Hollywood's annals. His partner was Rob Lowe, another young god of this new era, and together they created that chemistry audiences felt through theater screens across America. The story of how McCarthy landed Class itself sounds like a Hollywood fairy tale. A friend called and told him about an audition, and the young actor, just beginning to master his craft, went to the casting call, not knowing this role would change his life's trajectory forever. But nobody then imagined that this was only the beginning, the first note in a symphony that would soon deafen the entire entertainment industry. Then came 1985, the year that became the apex for an entire generation of young actors. McCarthy starred in two films that forever entered the 80s cultural canon: St. Elmo's Fire and Pretty in Pink. In St. Elmo's Fire, he played Kevin Dolby, an idealistic writer, trying to find his place in the world after college, where every dream collides with the brutal reality of growing up. This film gathered all the Brat Pack stars under one roof: Demi Moore, Rob Lowe, Ali Sheedy, Judd Nelson, and created a phenomenon that defined the decade. But it was Pretty in Pink that gave McCarthy the image millions of teenage girls carried in their hearts for years. He played Blaine, a wealthy, handsome, but internally lost youth, torn between his feelings for Molly Ringwald's heroine and the pressure of his social circle. This film, directed by John Hughes, the wizard of 80s teen dramas, became an anthem for outsiders, for those who never fit the standards imposed by society. And McCarthy with his deep eyes and soft melancholy, became the face of this generation, a symbol of romance always balancing on tragedy's edge. 1987 brought a new wave of success. Mannequin, an absurd fairy tale romantic comedy where McCarthy falls in love with a mannequin that comes to life. And this film became a box office hit despite all the critics' skeptical reviews. Audiences weren't interested in critics' opinions. They wanted to see McCarthy on screen, wanted to believe in this impossible love, in this fairy tale that reflected their own youthful dreams. That same year came Less Than Zero, a dark, merciless drama about a generation mired in drugs, sex, and despair. The irony of fate was that precisely during the filming of this movie, McCarthy himself was sliding into the abyss of cocaine addiction. Art and reality intertwined in a cruel dance, and the boundaries between them blurred. 1989 became the year of Weekend at Bernie's, a comedy that turned into a cult phenomenon. A film about two friends pretending their dead boss is still alive sounded like a crazy idea, but it was precisely this crazy idea that brought McCarthy a new wave of popularity. His character, Larry Wilson, became the embodiment of a charming con artist who finds a way out of any situation, even the most absurd. But behind all these successes, behind magazine covers, behind fans' screams at premiere doors, hid a dark truth. McCarthy wasn't enjoying his fame. He drank to gain confidence before the camera, took cocaine to feel alive, and slowly, imperceptibly to those around him, destroyed everything he had built. The industry celebrated his beauty and talent, but nobody saw that behind this facade stood a young man drowning in his own demons. By the end of the 80s, Andrew McCarthy was at the peak. His name was synonymous with success. His face adorned posters in millions of teenagers' rooms worldwide. But the peak is a lonely and dangerous place where the air is thin and any wrong step can lead to a fall. And McCarthy was already taking those wrong steps, though the world didn't know it yet. The moment when millions of eyes caught his destiny also became the moment when his personal catastrophe began. Imperceptible, quiet, destructive. Behind the sparkling camera lights and premiere ovations hid a truth Andrew McCarthy concealed from the entire world and from himself. At 12 years old, he first tried alcohol, and this moment became a point of no return, though no one could have foreseen it then. The bottle gave him what he desperately sought in real life: confidence, freedom, power over his own fear. Alcohol gave me Dutch courage, confidence, sexiness, he admits years later, and in these words rings the bitterness of lost years. When fame washed over him in the 80s, addiction had already firmly woven itself into the fabric of his existence. He drank before filming, drank after it, drank alone in hotel rooms where the echo of his own thoughts became unbearable. Nobody on set noticed, or pretended not to notice, how the young actor was slowly sinking into the quagmire of chemical dependency. The industry was too busy stamping his image as the perfect young man to think about what was happening behind the scenes. By 1987, cocaine joined the alcohol. White powder that promised energy, euphoria, escape from reality. During the filming of Mannequin, McCarthy was already drinking excessively and regularly using drugs. But the real shock came on the set of Less Than Zero, a film that reflected his own life with frightening accuracy. Before a scene where he was supposed to jump into a pool, the actor took a dose of cocaine. When his body plunged into the cold water, his heart seized with an agonizing spasm. Pain pierced his chest, and for a moment he thought he was dying right there on the set, surrounded by cameras and assistants. This was a moment when death looked him in the eyes and whispered a warning. But McCarthy didn't stop. Addiction already held him in its claws too tightly. He continued using, continued drinking, continued destroying himself from within, as if testing how far he could go before everything collapsed completely. Parallel to his professional triumphs unfolded his personal life, chaotic, filled with brief romances and empty connections. In the 90s, he dated several women, including actresses and models, but no relationship could withstand the weight of his inner demons. The irony was that millions of girls dreamed of him, seeing a romantic hero on screen, but the real McCarthy couldn't even build a healthy relationship with himself. A drug-fueled road trip across the country with friends turned into a nightmare. Bars, cocaine, sleepless nights, a near bar fight in Colorado. In Missouri, they were stopped by police. McCarthy sat in the car, knowing cocaine was scattered on the back seat, trying to look as if he had just woken up while his heart pounded so hard it was ready to burst through his chest. An officer peered into the window, looked at him, and in those endless seconds, the actor saw how his entire career, his entire life could disappear in one instant. The policeman let them go, but the lesson was not learned. 3 years in the early 90s, he describes as lost and painful. These were years when addiction finally took over, when the line between existence and self-destruction blurred. One morning, he woke up in his apartment violently sick, his body racked by convulsions, and he fell to his knees in the middle of the room, realizing with terrifying clarity what his life had become. This was a moment of absolute rock bottom, when illusions dissipated and he saw himself as he really was, a young man slowly killing himself. But even in this darkness, a tiny spark of hope flickered. McCarthy understood that if he didn't stop now, the next time might be the last. In 1992, at the age of 29, he finally found the strength within himself to speak the words that would save his life. "I need help." This admission became the first step on a long road to redemption, a path that would require more courage from him than any film role. Behind the glamour facade, behind smiles on red carpets, behind the image of a romantic hero, hid a man fighting his own demons. And this battle was far more terrifying than any screenplay written for a Hollywood blockbuster. 1992 became the year when everything collapsed and simultaneously began anew. Andrew McCarthy lay on the floor of his apartment, his body racked by convulsions. Vomiting wouldn't stop, and in this moment of absolute rock bottom, he saw a truth from which he could no longer run. He was 29 years old, an age when most people are just beginning to build careers, and he had already destroyed his. "I was not managing anything very well," he would say years later, and in these words rings all the weight of realization that came too late. That same year, Gathering the last crumbs of courage, McCarthy spoke the words that would save his life. "I need help." He reached out to an organization in New York that specialized in addiction treatment and began the path to recovery, a path that would require more willpower than all the years of drinking combined. "There has to be somewhere to catch us, otherwise we fall," he would later explain before an audience of 900 people, sharing his recovery story. And in these words, an admission that without help, he wouldn't have survived. But recovery came with a price, the price of disappearing from public life. In the early years of sobriety, McCarthy did exactly what he was told: attended support groups, avoided social events, refused everything that could trigger a relapse. He completely isolated himself from Hollywood life, from parties, from that world that once seemed so alluring. "Within a couple of years, my life started to get better," he recalls, and this simplicity of words hides years of agonizing work on himself. Parallel to his personal collapse was a professional collapse. By the 90s, the Brat Pack label had already done its damage. Hollywood didn't know what to do with McCarthy when he stopped looking like a teenager. He wasn't a character actor, wasn't a leading man in the traditional sense. He was something in between, and the industry doesn't like in between. In 1991, he starred in Year of the Gun, a thriller set in 70s Italy, but the film barely left a mark at the box office. In 1993, he got a small role in The Joy Luck Club, a critically acclaimed ensemble drama. But by then he was no longer the lead, but a secondary character. Getting in 1994 went unnoticed. Dream Man in 1995 went straight to video. He wasn't failing spectacularly. He just wasn't relevant anymore. McCarthy describes this period as a time of deep disorientation. He spent his 20s being told he was special, being recognized everywhere, being somebody, and then suddenly he wasn't. Auditions dried up, calls stopped coming, and when they did, the roles felt humiliating. Or perhaps he just couldn't connect to them anymore. He describes a feeling of invisibility, not because people didn't know who he was, but because he himself didn't know who he was. The career that seemed unshakable in the 80s now hung by a thread. Demi Moore would later say that this label completely derailed their careers. At the time, it felt unjust, but she didn't take it personally over time. For McCarthy, though, this was something more than just professional failure. It was an existential collapse. The world he knew disappeared, and the new world had not yet formed. In the early 2000s, McCarthy did what almost no one in Hollywood does. He completely left acting and began building an entirely new career. He started writing travel essays. At first, these were small articles for magazines, but gradually he discovered that writing gave him what acting never did: a sense of control, authenticity, freedom. He traveled the world, Asia, Africa, South America, and in these travels found himself anew. The industry in the 80s was intoxicating and isolating in equal measure, he admits in interviews. You were constantly told you were special, but only if you stayed valuable, only if people still wanted you. He talked about how transactional it all felt, a trade where your personality was a commodity. And when the commodity no longer sold, you became invisible. Andrew McCarthy's disappearance wasn't dramatic. There was no scandal, no tragic ending. He just quietly slipped into the shadows, ceasing to be who everyone expected him to be. And in this silence, in this disappearance, he found something more valuable than fame. He found himself. But the path to this discovery lay through years of pain, loss, and absolute rock bottom. The turning point came not when he became famous, but when he dared to admit he was broken. When the world of acting fame collapsed, Andrew McCarthy found himself in emptiness. But it was precisely in this emptiness that he began building something new, something authentic. Travel began as escape, as a way to leave behind who he was, who they wanted him to be. He would grab a backpack and head to places where no one knew his face, where the name Andrew McCarthy meant nothing. Peru, Chile, Sudan, Mount Kilimanjaro, the geography of his travels became a map of his internal transformation. At first, he wrote for himself, short vignettes, sketches of encounters with people, scenes that captured the essence of a moment. I could write dialogue, I knew character, and I knew setting, all from acting, he recalls. He wrote for 10 years without thinking about publication because he was an actor, right? But writing gave him what acting never did: the ability to control the narrative, to be the author of his own story rather than a character in someone else's script. But everything changed when he gathered the courage to show his work to Keith Bellows, editor-in-chief of National Geographic Traveler. When I first met Andrew McCarthy, he had never been published, Bellows recalls. He convinced me to take a chance on him. And that chance paid off handsomely. McCarthy began writing for the magazine, and his articles were unlike anything else. He didn't just describe places, he explored his own internal journey, how travel changes a person from within. I began writing about travel because I noticed that many articles lacked the deeply personal and transformative essence of my own journeys, he explains. His writing was filled with attention to detail, introspection, exploration of the fear that accompanies every journey into the unknown. He wrote about feeling untethered during solo travels and trying to find in writing a way to ground himself. By 2010, McCarthy was named Travel Journalist of the Year by the Society of American Travel Writers, an incredible achievement for a man once known only for his face on screen. In 2011, he received their Grand Award. He became a two-time Lowell Thomas Award winner. His articles appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, Travel Plus Leisure, Afar, Slate. He became an editor-at-large at National Geographic Traveler, a position he held for 12 years. Parallel to his writing career, McCarthy discovered another talent in himself: directing. If acting was about being seen and writing about being heard, then directing was about creating worlds. He began directing episodes for television, and his work quickly attracted attention. Gossip Girl, White Collar, The Blacklist, Grace and Frankie, Happy-ish. The list of series where he worked as director grew each year. But his real breakthrough came with his work on Orange is the New Black, the cult Netflix series that changed perceptions of women's prison dramas. McCarthy directed several episodes, and his directorial style, attentive to detail, character-focused, emotionally rich, fit perfectly with the show's aesthetic. Andrew McCarthy has segued into a prolific directing career, critics note. The irony was that the man who spent the 80s in front of the camera now found freedom behind it. Directing gave him control he never had as an actor. He could shape stories, direct actors, create emotional arcs. Everything he learned from years of his own work in front of the camera. In 2017, McCarthy published his first book, The Longest Way Home, a memoir about travel, family, and the search for identity. The book became a New York Times bestseller. He wrote about how travel helped him find himself, how fear accompanies every step into the unknown, and how precisely in this fear lies the possibility of transformation. "I'm no longer shy nor filled with angst," he says in interviews. 26 years after that rock bottom when he lay on the floor of his apartment, McCarthy transformed into a person no one expected to see. Not an actor, not a former star, but a writer, director, traveler, a man who found peace with himself. The transformation was neither quick nor easy. It lasted decades, passing through pain, loneliness, uncertainty. But in the ruins of oblivion, he built something more solid than fame. He built a life that had meaning. In May 2021, almost 40 years after the article that changed everything, Andrew McCarthy released a book that became an act of courage and redemption. Brat, an 80s story. A memoir no one expected to see from a man who had avoided talking about the past for decades. He wrote it without a pre-existing publishing contract because he wanted to explore what he had to say, not knowing if anyone would want to hear it. He spent 6 months contemplating before beginning to write. And when he started, the words flowed. Honest, painful, revealing. The book instantly became a New York Times bestseller and was nominated for the Goodreads Choice Award in the Best Memoir category. Critics noted its surprising and refreshing honesty, its ability to reveal vulnerability and raw pain that the author stoically attempts to contain even now. McCarthy wrote about his insecurity, about addiction, about toxic masculinity he faced in youth, about how acting simultaneously liberated and destroyed him. This wasn't just a book about fame. It was a book about surviving when your identity becomes a commodity and your life turns into a brand. I wrote the book because I realized this was a critically important chapter of my life that I had never deeply explored, he admits in interviews. For years, people asked him to write about those times, and he always refused before they could finish their sentence. But with age comes a willingness to face one's own reflections, and he felt ready. He wanted every story to reveal not just unknown facts, but something deeper about that era, about his internal battles, about what it means to come of age in fame's whirlwind. But the book was only the beginning. In 2024, almost 40 years after that damn New York Magazine article, McCarthy directed the documentary Brats, an attempt to finally reconcile with a past that had haunted him his entire life. He embarked on a journey across America, meeting with former Brat Pack members, people with whom he shared fame but never talked about what that fame really meant. The first meeting was with Emilio Estevez, the man the article dubbed the unofficial president of the Brat Pack, and whom McCarthy hadn't seen since the St. Elmo's Fire premiere almost 40 years ago. Estevez confessed that the label derailed his career and that he actively distanced himself from other group members, even refusing scripts that could have reunited them on screen. Working together, we were like kryptonite to each other, he said, and in these words was all the bitterness of missed opportunities. Ali Sheedy shared her sense of injustice. It felt like they just wrote off everybody's lives and their experiences and their work. Demi Moore, whom McCarthy hadn't seen in decades, asked him a question that flipped the entire film's concept. Why did we take offense? She admitted that at the time it felt unjust, a limited perspective. But now, from the height of 40 years, it looked different. It was Moore, with her insightfulness and love, who nudged McCarthy to reconsider his toxic, decades-long relationship with that label. Rob Lowe, John Cryer. Each conversation was a variation on one theme, how they felt then, and how they view that time now with the benefit of 4 decades of hindsight. Some refused to participate, Molly Ringwald, Judd Nelson, but those who agreed found the conversation healing. The meeting with journalist David Blum, who wrote that very article, became the climax. Blum admitted there were just plain old not nice things in the article for which he should have been scolded. The documentary was released in June 2024 on Hulu after premiering at the Tribeca Film Festival. Our perception of things can change over time, McCarthy noted. The Brat Pack was a part of my past that I had to reconcile with, and this film allowed me to do that. In the film's final scenes, McCarthy's face reveals a sense of liberation and self-discovery, a man who finally found peace with the ghosts of his past. Beyond the memoir and documentary, McCarthy continued multiplying his achievements. The Longest Way Home, his first travel memoir, became a New York Times bestseller, and the Financial Times named it one of the best books of the year. His debut novel, Just Fly Away, was published in 2017. In 2015, he was guest editor for the prestigious Best American Travel series. All 4 of his books became New York Times bestsellers, an incredible achievement for a man once known only as an actor. As a director, he has helmed nearly 100 hours of television content, working on dozens of series. His directing career became no less successful than his acting career once was. He married Dolores Rice in 2011, and they have 3 children. The life he built in sobriety proved richer and fuller than anything he had in the days of fame. Over time, the Brat Pack has become the wonderfully iconic, affectionate term, McCarthy says now. What once seemed like a curse became part of cultural heritage, a symbol of an era that will never repeat. The second wind came not from returning to fame, but from accepting who he became, not a star, but a man who found meaning in writing, directing, travel, family. The New Horizons proved wider than any screen on which he ever appeared. Andrew McCarthy became more than an actor. He became a symbol of an era, the embodiment of a generation's youth, a living reminder of a time when everything seemed possible. I represent youth for a generation. How did that happen? He asks himself today, and in this question rings genuine surprise. The man who spent decades running from his past finally realized that his legacy isn't in the roles he played, but in how those roles reflected the dreams and fears of millions. The Brat Pack was never a real group. It was a cultural construct, a myth created by one article on one summer day in 1985. Journalist David Bloom coined the term as a play on Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack, but what began as a barbed jest transformed into a phenomenon that defined a decade. Molly Ringwald, Emilio Estevez, Anthony Michael Hall, Rob Lowe, Andrew McCarthy, Demi Moore, Judd Nelson, Ali Sheedy. These names became synonymous with the 80s, though many of them barely knew each other. The irony was that once the label stuck, the Brat Pack ceased to exist as a phenomenon. Once it became a label, it was over, McCarthy explains. Directors stopped making films with their participation fearing this stigma, and the actors themselves actively distanced themselves from each other, trying to prove they were more than a stereotype. Demi Moore would later call it a derailment of their careers. But time transformed perception. By the 2020s, the Brat Pack had become the wonderfully iconic, affectionate term. What seemed like a curse became a blessing, a cultural legacy that defined a generation. Films like 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, St. Elmo's Fire, Pretty in Pink became not just movies. They became time capsules, preserving the hopes, fears, and dreams of an era. St. Elmo's Fire was a precursor to Friends, a story about a group of young people just out of college trying to figure out who they are. Without the Brat Pack, there would be no Friends, no aesthetic of ensemble dramas that dominates modern culture. McCarthy himself became the architect of his legacy, not through acting, but through his ability to transform. 33 years of sobriety. This isn't just a statistic, it's a testament to willpower and the daily choice to live differently. There has to be somewhere to catch us, otherwise we fall, he said before an audience of 900 people sharing his recovery story. His candor about addiction, about struggle, about fear, became a beacon for thousands facing the same demons. 4 New York Times bestsellers, dozens of travel awards, nearly 100 hours of television content as director. This is a legacy built on the ruins of fame. But the most important legacy is how he changed the narrative about what it means to be a star. He showed that one can hit rock bottom and rise again, that one can lose oneself and find oneself anew, that fame isn't the end of the story, but only its beginning. For a long time, I despised this aspect of my past, McCarthy admits. Now, I view it as one of the greatest blessings of my career. The beauty of it is that it has transformed into an endearingly iconic term, making me realize I represent youth for a generation. That's actually pretty amazing, you know? In these words, acceptance, wisdom, peace with oneself. When McCarthy met David Bloom, the journalist who wrote that article, he discovered something unexpected: affection. What astonished me more than Bloom's reaction was my genuine affection for the man whose 3 small words had caused me so much turmoil. He says, this moment became the culmination of his journey, the ability to forgive not only others but himself. The documentary Brats concludes with the iconic gesture from The Breakfast Club, Judd Nelson's raised fist, which McCarthy considers the exclamation point of the Brat Pack image. This isn't just a reference to a cult film. It's a symbol of triumph, an acknowledgement that the past no longer has power over the present. Andrew McCarthy's mythology isn't a myth about a Hollywood heartthrob or a star's tragic fall. It's a myth about transformation, about how a person can pass through the fire of addiction and emerge on the other side, not just surviving, but renewed. It's a story about accepting one's vulnerability, about turning a curse into a blessing, about finding meaning not in who you were, but in who you became. Today, at 62 years old, McCarthy lives with his wife Dolores Rice and their 3 children, a life he could never have imagined in his days of fame. He's no longer a star in the traditional sense, but his influence runs deeper than any on-screen role. He became living proof that redemption is possible, that transformation is real, that it's never too late to rewrite your story. McCarthy's mark on history isn't just a filmography or a list of awards. It's a story about a generation that grew up with him, witnessed his fall and resurrection, and found in his journey a reflection of their own struggles. The Brat Pack mythology lives on not because those films were perfect, but because they captured something authentic, a moment in time when youth believed in its invincibility, and one man dared to show that behind this confidence lay fragility, fear, humanity. And in the end, it is precisely this humanity, his greatest legacy,